The call came at 2:14 inches the morning. I know the exact time because I'd been lying awake anyway. The way men my age often do, joints aching from the cold. Mind turning over old thoughts that don't have the decency to wait until daylight. My phone lit up the ceiling of my bedroom, and when I saw my granddaughter's name, my stomach dropped before I even answered. She was 14 years old. She didn't call me at 2 inches the morning to chat. Grandpa. Her voice was so small I almost didn't recognize it. Wet, shaking. Grandpa, I'm at Scarborough Health Network. Mom's boyfriend brought me in. He said I slipped on the ice on the back steps. But Grandpa, and here she stopped, and I heard her trying very hard not to cry louder than she already was. He pushed me. He grabbed my arm, and he pushed me into the wall, and I fell down the stairs. And Mom, won't she keep saying I must have misremembered? She keeps saying Daniel would never. I was already sitting up, already reaching for my glasses on the nightstand. Which unit, sweetheart? Emergency. They have me in a room. Mom and Daniel are in the waiting area. The nurse let me use her phone because mine is at home. I'm on my way, I said. Don't say anything else to anyone until I get there. Not to Daniel. Not to anyone. Just wait for me. Okay. Are you in pain right now? A pause. My shoulder. And my wrist. They took x-rays already. I'm coming. I love you. Don't hang up. Keep talking to me while I get my coat on. I'm 64 years old and I live alone in a semi-detached in East York. The same house where I raised my daughter after her mother passed. My daughter, I'll call her my daughter, because that's what she is. That's the only thing she's ever been to me. Had moved out 6 years ago. Remarried a man I'd never warmed to, and moved across the city to Mississauga. The drive from my house to Scarborough at that hour was 40 minutes. Maybe less, with no traffic on the 401. It felt like 4 hours. I kept my granddaughter on the line as long as I could, until a nurse gently took the phone back and told me she'd make sure my granddaughter was comfortable until I arrived. I thanked her. I put my hazards on out of pure habit and immediately turned them off again because there was nobody else on the road. I thought about my granddaughter at 2 years old, sitting on my kitchen floor banging a wooden spoon on a pot. I thought about her at 7, showing me how to do something on my phone with the patience of a saint and the condescension only a child can get away with. I thought about the last time I'd seen her at Christmas 6 weeks ago, and how she'd seemed quieter than usual, how I'd told myself it was just adolescence. I had not listened hard enough. The emergency department at Scarborough Health Network was quiet in that specific way hospitals go quiet. In the deep middle of the night, not empty, never empty, but hushed, everyone moving carefully as if sound itself might break something. A young nurse at the desk checked my name against my granddaughter's file and walked me back without asking many questions, which told me more than she probably intended to. My granddaughter was sitting on a cot with a thin blanket across her lap and a temporary splint running from her palm to halfway up her forearm. She looked up when I came through the curtain, and her face crumpled in a way I hadn't seen since she was very small and had fallen off her bicycle on the driveway. Not the pain of the injury. The relief of not being alone anymore. I sat down beside her and put my arm around her shoulders, the uninjured side, and didn't say anything for a moment. Sometimes there isn't anything to say that words do justice to. Tell me what happened, I said, when she'd steadied a little. All of it. From the beginning, she had been coming down the back staircase from her room, an interior staircase that leads to the kitchen. One of those narrow ones common in older Mississauga builds from the 80s. Daniel had been in the kitchen. She'd startled him, she thought, coming down in the dark, and he'd grabbed her arm hard, she said, harder than she'd ever been grabbed before, the kind of hard that isn't an accident. And when she'd pulled back from him, he'd showed her, and she'd gone down 4 steps and hit the landing with her shoulder and wrist taking the impact. What was he doing in the kitchen at that hour? I asked. She shook her head. I don't know. I couldn't sleep either. I just wanted a glass of water. Had he touched you before? Grabbed you? Or pushed you? She looked at her splinted wrist. Not like that. He grabs my arm sometimes when I'm not moving fast enough. When I'm taking too long leaving the car or whatever. Mom thinks I'm dramatic about it. I kept my voice very even. When did this start? Since they got serious. Maybe a year ago? It got worse after they moved in together. She picked at the edge of the hospital blanket with her good hand. He never does it in front of her. It's always when she's in another room or on the phone or something. And then if I say anything, she asks me why I'm always trying to cause problems. There it was. The shape of it. A pattern of control so gradual that the person inside it stops being able to see the edges. A doctor came in about 10 minutes after I arrived. She was perhaps 40, efficient without being cold. And she'd clearly done this kind of conversation before. She nodded at me, confirmed I was listed as emergency contact on my granddaughter's file. My daughter had put me down when the child was small, and apparently hadn't updated it. And then she asked my granddaughter if she could speak with me briefly in the hallway. I stepped out. The doctor pulled the curtain closed and turned to me. The X-ray shows a non-displaced fracture of the distal radius, she said. That's the wrist, and a significant bruise pattern on the upper arm consistent with a grip 4 fingers. Thumb. The kind of mark you get when someone grabs hard. She paused. The mechanism described to us when they came in a slip on icy steps doesn't account for the bruising on the arm. A fall would explain the wrist. It doesn't explain the grip marks. I looked at her steadily. What does the grip mark explain? It explains that someone grabbed her arm with significant force before or during the fall. She held my gaze. I'm a mandatory reporter under Ontario's Child, Youth and Family Services Act. I've already initiated a report to Child Protective Services. That process is underway regardless of what anyone in that waiting room says. I want you to understand that. This isn't something that can be walked back. Good, I said. What do you need from me? Right now, just stay with her. A social worker will be here within the hour. They'll want to speak with your granddaughter privately. After that, they'll likely want to speak with the mother and the boyfriend separately. She looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has seen this exact situation more times than they should have to. How is the mother likely to respond? I thought about my daughter. I thought about who she was before and who she'd become in the last 2 years, and the gap between those two versions of her that I'd been pretending wasn't as wide as it was. She's going to defend him first, I said. And then I think, if someone gives her enough room and enough time, she'll come back to herself. The doctor nodded. That's common. She touched my arm briefly. Your granddaughter is lucky, she called someone. I went back inside. My granddaughter was looking at the ceiling with the careful blankness teenagers deploy when they're trying not to feel too much at once. The doctor told you, she said. She told me. Is Mom going to be really angry? I sat back down beside her. Your mother loves you more than anything in the world. She's made some choices lately that haven't shown that clearly enough, but that's not who she is at her core. And I don't believe it's who she's going to stay. She was in the waiting room, my granddaughter said quietly. When I was getting my X-ray, I could hear her through the wall. She was telling Daniel it was going to be fine. She was comforting him. She said it without any particular drama. Just a flat stating of fact. The way children report devastating things when they've had some hours to go numb around the edges. And that flatness was somehow worse than the crying had been. I didn't say anything for a moment. I thought about all the ways a person can love someone and still fail them utterly. About how the failure almost always happens quietly, incrementally, in the small daily choices to look away. She shouldn't have been doing that, I said. That was wrong. I'm going to tell her so. She won't listen. She might not tonight, but she will eventually. I looked at my granddaughter. Do you know what I've learned in 64 years? The truth is patient. It waits. You can ignore it for a while, but you can't make it go away. And right now, the truth is being looked after by that doctor and the people she's called. Your job tonight is just to let the adults who are on your side do their work. The social worker arrived at 3:30. She was a young woman, younger than I expected, with a calm, professional manner and the specific tiredness of someone on a night rotation who has learned to function through it. She spoke with my granddaughter for about 20 minutes while I waited in the corridor. Then she came out and asked if she could speak with the mother. I'll come with you, I said. She gave me a measured look. It might be better if I'm not going to interfere, I said, but I'd like to be present. She's my daughter. She considered this briefly, then nodded. The waiting room was one of those institutional spaces that feel harshest at 3 inches the morning, fluorescent overhead, plastic chairs, a television mounted high on the wall playing something on mute. My daughter was sitting in the far corner with her arms crossed and her coat still on, as if she hadn't planned to stay long. The man beside her, Daniel, whom I had met precisely 4 times, and had formed a clear opinion of within approximately 15 minutes of the first meeting, was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, turning his phone in his hands. He was 41 years old. My daughter was 42. He owned a landscaping business, 2 trucks, and a half-renovated house in Streetsville. He was the kind of man who stood very straight and talked over people and called it confidence. My daughter looked up when I came in, and I watched her face do several things in quick succession: relief, guilt, and then a careful settling into defensiveness. "Dad, you didn't need to drive all the way out here in the middle of the night." "She called me," I said. "Of course I came." Daniel glanced at me and then at the social worker and back at his phone. "Attell," I noted. The social worker introduced herself and asked if she could speak with my daughter privately. Daniel began to say that he'd stay, and the social worker said, politely but without room for negotiation, that she'd like to speak with each of them separately if that was all right. He didn't like that. His jaw tightened in a way I suspected my daughter had learned not to notice. While Daniel was asked to wait across the room, the social worker sat with my daughter and me. She explained the reporting obligations, the nature of my granddaughter's injuries, and what the doctor's assessment had found. She used plain language. She didn't editorialize. My daughter sat through all of this with her arms crossed, and when the social worker finished, she said, "Kids fall. She's always been clumsy." She fell on the ice. The bruising on her upper arm, the social worker said, is not consistent with a fall. She could have grabbed the railing. The pattern is consistent with a hand, a grip. The social worker was very calm. "Your daughter described to us what happened. She was scared and confused. And she's a teenager. She exaggerates everything." "Hey." My voice came out quieter than I intended, which was probably for the best. "Look at me." My daughter looked at me, and for a moment, underneath all the defensive scaffolding she'd built around herself, I could see her. The girl who used to sit on the back porch with me in the summers. The young woman I'd watched become a mother. The person she was before she'd started disappearing into someone else's idea of who she should be. "I've seen her wrist," I said. "I've seen the bruising on her arm. I've sat with her and listened to her. That child is not exaggerating. And somewhere underneath all of this, you know that too." Silence. "She's 14, I said. "She called me from a nurse's phone in the middle of the night because she had no one else, because her mother was in the waiting room comforting the man who put her in the hospital." My daughter's jaw worked. "You don't know Daniel. You've never given him a fair—" "I know what those marks on her arm mean," I said. "And so do you, if you'll let yourself." It wasn't a dramatic moment. She didn't break down. She looked away from me, out the window at the parking lot in the dark, and she was very still for a long time. The social worker let the silence sit. She was good at her job. When my daughter finally spoke again, her voice was different, quieter, like something had shifted underneath it. "She really said he pushed her?" "Yes. Not just the fall. He grabbed her first. That's what the doctor's assessment shows, and what she told us herself." "Yes." My daughter put her hand over her mouth. She was quiet for another long moment. Then she said, to no one in particular, "He grabbed her arm once before. At Christmas. I told myself I'd imagined it. There it was. The crack in the wall. Small, but there." "You didn't imagine it," I said. She looked at me then, and her eyes were full of something complicated and exhausted and old. "What do I do right now?" "You go talk to your daughter. You go in that room and you sit with her and you tell her you believe her. That's the first thing. Everything else can come after." The social worker outlined what the next steps would look like: a formal investigation, a safety plan, the requirement that Daniel not have unsupervised access to my granddaughter during the process. My daughter listened this time, really listened, instead of constructing rebuttals. I watched it happen and felt something loosen slightly in my chest. I stayed in the waiting room while my daughter went to see her. Daniel had caught enough of the tone to understand that things were not moving in his direction, and had grown increasingly still in his chair across the room. When the social worker indicated she'd like to speak with him next, he stood up and said he thought they should call a lawyer before anyone said anything else, which told me everything I needed to know about his conscience on the matter. My daughter was in with my granddaughter for almost 40 minutes. I drank a cup of coffee from a machine in the corridor that tasted like hot water that had heard a rumor about coffee, and I thought about all the nights I'd lain awake over the past 2 years, half knowing something was wrong and telling myself it wasn't my place to interfere in my daughter's life. that she was an adult, that she'd made her choice. We tell ourselves that to avoid the cost of doing something about it. My granddaughter was going to need a cast for 6 weeks. She would need a follow-up appointment with an orthopedic clinic her family doctor could refer her through OHIP, no cost. The nurse had already confirmed it. She would need a social worker checking in on her situation over the coming weeks. She would need more than any of that to know that the adults in her life were paying attention. I thought about her telling me that Daniel grabbed her arm when she wasn't moving fast enough, the casualness of it, the way she'd already integrated it into her understanding of normal. That was the thing that sat heaviest in my chest. Not the single moment of the fall, terrible as it was, the months of small erosions that had preceded it, the way a child adjusts her expectations downward so gradually that she stops knowing they've adjusted at all. When my daughter came back out to the waiting room, her eyes were red. She sat down beside me. She forgave me, she said. I don't know why she forgave me. I wouldn't forgive me. She's 14 and she loves her mother, I said. Kids are better at that than we deserve. My daughter was quiet. Then, I'm going to have him removed from the house. Good. I don't know what I was doing. I knew. I think I knew. I just kept. She stopped. I kept choosing not to look directly at it. I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything useful to say. She knew what she'd done, and she'd have to live with it. And the only productive direction from here was forward. I'd said what needed saying in that room. She can stay with me, I said. Both of you can. If you need to. East York's not far. The TTC runs from the end of my street. We'll figure out school. She looked at me. You'd do that? I looked back at her. She's my granddaughter. You're my daughter. Of course I'd do that. We sat there together in the plastic chairs as the waiting room began to lighten almost imperceptibly, the fluorescent quality of the light shifting towards something that promised, if not morning exactly, the direction of morning. A porter moved through with a cart. An orderly laughed at something with a nurse at the desk. The world had kept going, the way it does, through the worst hours. My granddaughter was discharged just before 6 in the morning with a proper temporary cast, written instructions for a follow-up through her OHIP coverage, and a referral to a youth counselor. Through the hospital's social work team, an 8-week program, no wait list at this particular office, which felt like something close to luck. The nurse who had let her use the phone earlier came by to check on her before we left, and my granddaughter thanked her with a seriousness that made the nurse smile. You were smart to call someone, the nurse told her. I called my grandpa, my granddaughter said, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. We drove back through a city that was just beginning to wake up delivery trucks, early commuters, the first buses running their routes through streets still dark enough to need their headlights on. My granddaughter fell asleep in the back seat within 10 minutes, her head against the window, her casted arm held carefully in her lap. My daughter sat in the passenger seat and looked out at the road. The landscaping season starts in April, she said, out of nowhere. He was counting on me to float the household expenses until then. That's not your problem anymore. No. A pause. I know. I merged onto the 401 heading west, the city spreading out in all directions in the gray pre-dawn light. Somewhere behind us, Daniel was sitting in a room with a social worker who had very particular questions for him. The investigation would take time. These things always do. But the mandatory report was filed, the documentation was on record, and in Ontario the system, slow as it sometimes moves, does move. Dad, my daughter said. I'm sorry I made you drive out here in the middle of the night. I glanced over at her. Don't ever be sorry for that. She turned her face back to the window. We drove. The city gave way to the first pale edge of sunrise coming up behind us, and I kept both hands on the wheel. And the girl in the back seat slept the way children sleep when they finally feel safe completely, trusting the person driving to know the way home. I knew the way home. I'd known it for 64 years. Some roads you don't forget. If anything in this story reminded you of something you've seen in your own family, a child who seems quieter than they should be, an adult who grabs just a little too hard, a pattern that looks like nothing, until suddenly it looks like everything, trust what you're seeing. In Canada, any adult can report a concern about a child's safety to Child Protective Services. You don't need proof. You don't need certainty. You just need to make the call. The number in Ontario is the Child Protection Hotline, 1-800-366-0656. Other provinces have their own lines. Look it up before you need it. And if you know a child who is listening right now, please, tell them that calling someone is always the right thing to do, that it is never, ever their fault, and that the adults who love them will come.